Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Sabio's Interaction Analytics Success webinar with NewDay today. I'm pleased to introduce Don McDonald, Interactions Performance Consultant at Sabio, and Matt Baxter, Senior Manager for Interaction Analytics at NewDay. Today, they will be taking you through how NewDay successfully use speech analytics to better understand the conversations that they have between customers and the NewDay advisors. If you do have any questions for either Don or Matt or someone in the team, please do drop them in the questions box and we can take those towards the end of the webinar. Over to you, Don.
Thanks very much, Emily. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don McDonald, Interaction Performance Consultant with Sabio. My purpose is working with clients like Matt to sweat the systems through a combination of training, consultancy, and optimization. Really excited to be speaking to Matt. Matt and I have been working for a number of years using the speech analytics tool to deliver insights into the conversations being had. Matt, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Don. Yes, my name is Matt Baxter. I am the Senior Manager of Interaction Analytics at NewDay. We sit within the optimization team, which sits within our customer service and service delivery. So essentially, we're looking at calls and all customer interactions to understand what we can do to improve both the customer and employee and policy experience. As Don mentioned, we've been using the tool for quite a lot of years and get a lot of value out of it. Look forward to talking about it a bit more.
Thank you very much, Matt. One of the things that we've spoken about recently is an initiative that you've had where you've been implementing analysis of onboarding of new customers across different demographics and brands. Can you talk a little bit about the benefits that you've found from that initiative, please?
Of course, to give a little bit of background, NewDay as a company has a lot of different brands. We have a lot of our own brands and we work with a lot of clients. And, like most companies, we're constantly taking on new customers. Now, yearly, we handle millions of calls as an organization, and probably 20% plus of those calls are from customers within the first 60 days of onboarding their account. And speech analytics has allowed us to look at those calls and target them in a really effective way. So it varies from brand to brand because we offer different experiences and different products, but we're able to target why the customers are contacting us. So we know that customers contact us on day zero, so the day of actual application, and we can follow that through on a day-by-day basis, and we understand the different nature of the calls on different days. So on day zero, for example, on certain brands, we know that customers are talking about registering for an online service. If we fast forward a week later for some of the credit card brands, we know that people are contacting us because they've received their card and they may be wanting to activate that card. And we can get really specific and we can drill down to literally day one through 60, further if we chose to, but those are the days that we focus on and understand what is driving that contact on a day-by-day basis, and then expanding upon that with other data sources, linking those data sources into it. We can understand what drives those customers demographically, from products, based on the mailings and marketing that we send, what triggers happen and how customers respond to those based on how they're calling us. So it's a really powerful thing that we get a huge amount of benefit from. And it's something that we continue to do and link to multiple other data sources. So I really can't understate how powerful it is to be able to understand those journeys for us.
As part of your setup there within NewDay, one of the things that I find most exciting about how you implement and use speech analytics is that you're part of, as you said, you're part of the optimization team, which allows you you've got everyone that you need there to actually drive forward change. What kind of changes have you managed to implement off the back of the onboarding analysis that you've been doing?
There's been a lot of changes. Probably some really good examples are some of the simpler changes. So, for example, we when we really started looking at the onboarding journeys and the post-onboarding journeys, we noticed that certain mailings triggered certain calls, and we found that it was just simple wording in letters that customers would tell us that I was a little bit confused by this wording. So we've been able to do things as simple as just changing how something's phrased. We've also been able to actually change how quickly we send out certain comms. So certain communications, from a credit card perspective, if communication arrived before a card, the customer might be confused by that and they'd be prompted to call us. So just by changing that and moving it back a couple of days, we can change that and prevent that confusion. But on top of that, there is changes to actual product, changes to our IVR structure, changes to app and online journeys. All of these are quite minor changes. They're often not kind of cataclysmic, huge operational changes. They're often quite relatively small things, but collectively these small things impact a huge group of customers and drive a huge amount of calls. And of course, the other thing is that it allows us to help and understand and handle those calls better because we can anticipate them. So we can also feed that data into our forecasting team so that we can make sure that if we know we've taken on 1,000 customers today, that in 8 days' time, what percentage of those customers we can expect to be calling and asking these types of questions. So it's a really powerful on a number of levels. And of course, empowering the associates to know what kind of conversations they're going to be having with customers that are calling from this stage in their life cycle as well.
Beautiful. So it's a very, very specific use of the analytics data that you have in there. Other specific uses because of the financial services aspect of your business. Obviously, vulnerable customers is a very key thing, and the customer duty legislation that's coming in. From a vulnerable customers perspective, I know a lot of the work that you've done really drills deep into the conversations that are being had. Can you talk a little bit about the vulnerable customer side of things and how you use speech analytics to uncover the insights and understand the outcomes for those customers?
Yes, of course. I mean, as you said, vulnerability is hugely important. But customers don't necessarily call up and want to volunteer their vulnerabilities. So they're not necessarily going to, lay them out and say, I meet this certain criteria, because people don't think of themselves in that way. So it's really important that we use kind of speech analytics to help us identify and zero in on those, make sure that our associates are taking the correct actions for those customers. So we have a lot of vulnerability categories that we use, and they're broken down into subcategories. So we have physical health, mental health, financial circumstances, and a number of others. And by actually targeting those and looking at those categories and combinations of how those categories fit with each other, we're able to produce reports that then highlights where customers have hit multiple vulnerability triggers. So they may have only hit one vulnerability trigger, they may have hit multiple. We have the way that we use those categories, and we can feed that data into other teams that can then kind of do spot checks and check on those, and we can get a sense of whether they're going up or whether they're going down. Now, over the last 3 or 4 years, obviously, there's a lot has happened in the world in terms of not just the pandemic, but recessions and cost of living crisis and ongoing inflation. And these things trigger different types of conversations, particularly in a financial services company like ours. And being able to track those and make sure that we're actually doing the best thing for our customers, and that we constantly look at those. And there's people around the business. It's not just myself. I'm just one cog in the wheel of ensuring that we are doing the responsible thing for our customers. And speech analytics is a really invaluable tool for doing that.
And I think when we've spoken before, the same applies, or maybe more so applies actually to the customer duty aspect of things, because it's such a big initiative in ensuring that customer duty is adhered to, and that we are looking after our customers in the correct way. So from a customer duty perspective, you're an important part of a much bigger picture. Would that be correct?
Yes, I mean, it's certainly a company-wide effort with lots of people across different departments who take the lead on that. And my role as, within interaction analytics is to ensure that we're capturing the right data that feeds into their needs, to make sure that we are doing the right thing for those customers from a number of different perspectives. So in a sense, we were kind of ahead of the curve in that respect, because we were already kind of looking at the vulnerability and flagging it in a lot of different ways, which has allowed us probably to take less effort than we perhaps would have had to, because we were already doing that. Vulnerability is just one of many things that we look at. And vulnerability is obviously a very broad category. But certainly, without that data that's feeding into speech analytics, passively, without us, having to actually proactively look for it, consumer duty would prove to be much more difficult.
You spoke previously around the demand management side of things and feeding into the planning teams, your WFM planning teams, and speech analytics can help to provide a lot of insights to kind of bust myths around where demand is coming from. Are there specific examples of where you've seen maybe dips or spikes in demand that you use speech analytics data to help drive decisions being made within the operation, kind of more in a very tactical kind of way?
There's numerous examples. I mean, there are certainly incident or event-driven examples that help us understand where we deviate from perhaps forecasts and plans. We had a very good example just yesterday, where there was a third-party incident that drove, speech analytics is telling me this morning that drove an additional 700 calls yesterday. That's an additional 700 handled calls. And of course, that we feel that in our service, we see wait times increase, we see, potential abandoned rates, go up, which obviously is not ideal and that we don't want that. But by understanding why that happened, which we can get to very, very quickly, we can communicate that impact. That's an example of something that is incident driven. However, over time, we've seen our call landscape change, or the mix of the nature of the calls that we've got. So the nature of the calls that we had perhaps 5 years ago were very different from the nature of the calls that we have now. We're a much more digitally driven organization. Our customers are much more self-sufficient. They use apps and web to self-serve in the majority of things. So our calls have moved very much away from the transactional to supporting customers to serve themselves. Those are often much more complex conversations. So understanding and being able to break down the nature of the calls by type helps us understand the length of those calls, the AHT of those calls, the dynamics of those calls. And that's feeding that into our planning team enables them to say, it's not just that we're going to get X amount of calls today, it's that we're going to get this breakdown of different types of calls. So you may have one headline AHT, but you can understand that 500 of those calls are perhaps going to be 700 seconds long because they are this is the nature of those conversations, and you'll have another 300 that perhaps only 200 seconds long because of the nature of those conversations. And you'd be amazed over, if you look at the kind of the speech analytics month on month, you often don't see a huge amount of change in the trends and the nature of the calls unless they are driven by those incidents. But if you look at it over a longer timeline, you do see those fairly significant changes that are not necessarily perceptible week to week and even month to month. But over, say, an 18-month, 2-year timeline, they are quite dramatic changes, and actually being able to track those and understand them and feed that into other teams is really beneficial. And it's certainly something that we get a lot of value from.
In that digital journey, you talked about a lot of you've seen that shift across to more conversations around supporting people on the digital journey. Have you been able to identify any pain points or instances where the conversations that are happening around the digital journey have helped you actually improve the digital journey, or do you see a lot of content in the calls that can help you actually feed back into your IVRs, that digital journey, where you can actually specify things that within the optimization team you're able to make those improvements.
Absolutely. So going back over a long timeline, there's often you start with, of course, with the low-hanging fruit, which is problematic parts of the journey that perhaps cause people to kind of get stuck or lock themselves out of their online accounts, or perhaps go down the wrong route in an IVR. And that low-hanging fruit comes relatively easy because customers tend to tell you about it, and we can collate that. The speech analytics allows us to target that. There's a manual element that we can identify the right calls, and we can jump in and we can listen to those calls and we can collate that information and feed it back. As you mentioned, we're part of an optimization team, so we're fortunate that my colleagues within the same team as me are a delivery function. And that's a really important part to mention, because the insight without that actionable delivery is often kind of, it's just a bit of a so what, it's interesting, but without action. So that's kind of really important that we have that. But there's also, aside from the low-hanging fruits, you also have the kind of ongoing evolution. I mentioned briefly when we were talking a few questions back about how our customers vary brand to brand and demographically. So certain brands that we have a much older demographic. Now, it is not true to say that they're not necessarily digitally literate. We have digitally literate customers of all ages. But nevertheless, the way that they choose to use the products may vary from different demographics, and it's not all age-based. There's other factors in there as well. But we do understand that there are those variances. So a group of customers that may give us very little feedback about a product or an app may be perfectly happy with it. Another cohort of customers give us very different feedback. So we have to be mindful of that, and speech analytics allows us to surface that and understand how do we address it for customer bases that are ultimately using the same product but have very different wants and needs of that product. And we've used speech analytics a lot, particularly this year, in looking at that and looking at how that varies. Because some of the new clients that we've had brought in demographics that we haven't necessarily seen before, and that's been a really interesting evolution of how we're using it, and we're using that insight. But certainly, there are a lot of kind of easy wins in the early days, and because customers just tell you what they don't like, and it's quite easy to capture those. But yes, it can be much more sophisticated than that. But it takes time and effort, and a lot of listening to get to that. But without the tool, we couldn't get to it at all.
Yeah, and it's a really important point to understand, is that once you have speech analytics, the data is then available to you. You can't get to a lot of this data just simply by call listening. You need speech analytics, you need interaction analytics to actually help guide you to those conversations that you really want to be listening to. Which brings me on to QM. So from a quality management, quality monitoring perspective, I know your quality team very well, and I know that they use speech analytics, and it warms my heart when you talk about it, because you kind of dismiss it as it's just there. It's something though that you've put effort into actually putting together categories and pointers to get the quality team to the calls that they have, and it's just kind of fallen into the background now. It's just something that works. You talk a little bit about the quality side of things and what you've done from this perspective of speech to support your quality team, please.
Well, I mean, the first thing to mention is that we have as you alluded to, we have a very strong foundation at this point. We have hundreds of categories literally that are in situ, and a lot of that foundation, I can't take the credit for it. It was built by my colleagues that kind of predated me, but it's an ever-evolving foundation. So the nature of our conversations changed, so we maintain those categories and make sure that those categories are fit for purpose, and that we're capturing the right things, because the nature of how customers talk about things changes over time, and also the nature of our products and brands changes over time as well. So that's a constant evolution, and without maintaining that, the value of it degrades. So it's really important that we understand that. But how that feeds into the quality team, and I won't speak of their work in too much detail because they are a separate team. But my job within interaction analytics is to ensure that the categories are fit for purpose for them. So when they are quality checking the conversations that they have, they can use that for targeting if necessary, so they can target specific types of conversations, which is not just about categories, which can categorize things at high levels, like, online support or payments or direct debits or many others, much more niche categories in some instances, or vulnerabilities, which you alluded to, but also things like call dynamics. So this is not just about the quality team, we can feed this into kind of team managers to support performance conversations as well. We can look at things like, the call dynamics of silent time on a phone call, which we know where that is benchmarked and what we expect that to see. If we see that unusually high or consistently high, it suggests that there's potentially issues with knowledge gaps. So that's an indicator that we can use there. But there's also how we kind of pull in the metadata as well, and how that sits on the top. So all of that can get fed into the quality management team that enriches what they're doing. But we can also link that into, so it's not just that team that we feed into, so there's our customer experience team as well, that obviously looks after all of the surveys and the voice of the customer data. And by linking that into the speech analytics data, which we now do, that provides a lot of additional value as well. So we can understand customers are literally giving us feedback and telling us how they felt about the call or their experience or whatever it was. And we can link that back to that conversation. And we can actually look at that conversation and see what speech analytics is telling us. Did we capture expressions of dissatisfaction on that call? So did the customer mention that they wanted to make a complaint? Did the customer mention that they were unhappy with something? All of those things that we can capture and see if it aligns with the feedback that they're giving us. And again, we can capture all of that, which we feed into our quality team. So alongside the vulnerability, which we discussed earlier, we can also capture the expressions of dissatisfaction to make sure from a responsibility perspective, we're handling any expressions of dissatisfaction as we should. But also, we can overlay that against the other categories as well. So what types of conversations are triggering expressions of dissatisfaction? And again, we capture that in a number of different ways, and we share that with our quality team who do their deep dives and their checks on the back of that.
Yeah,
Apologies,
I think you're no, that's totally fine. You can tangent as much as you want. I think you raise a really important point there that I'm hoping people are getting the understanding here that this is not a magic button. It's not a magic button. You don't just press a button. A lot of effort has actually gone into the establishing the configuration, the categories that you've got in there, and as you say, it's been a really large team effort. Over the years, these things have been built up, but also in analyzing that data, but the application gives you the tools to make it easier. So overlaying categories on other categories to help you get closer to dissatisfaction reasons. So what are the reasons for dissatisfaction? One of the things that you mentioned there was around the metadata. So the metadata that you have coming in and sitting on top of the interaction, top of those call recordings. You've also mentioned around taking the data that you have in speech analytics and sharing that with other parts of the operation. I believe on a daily basis, you're making this data available out to other areas of the operation. Can you talk a little bit to the value of having that data coming in, but also sharing that data out? So your metadata coming in and you being able to share that data out.
So, I mean, ultimately, speech analytics, and we obviously that's what we're here to talk about, is often it's a part of a much bigger picture of insight, and it's often the starting point because there's not a lot of insight is much richer than what the customer's actually telling you with their own voice. But on top of that, we can follow it through to understand the experience. And the metadata is probably the first step in that. So that's essentially the data that we can tag onto those calls. So I can look in speech analytics and I can highlight those calls by category and I can understand that the customers that are calling us about a certain category, are they registered for e-servicing? You know, do they receive their statements through the post, or do they receive them, or do they look at them online? Are they registered for direct debits? Did they make a payment on this call? So there's a lot of rich information. The age of their account, what is the tenure of the customer? Have they been a customer for 5 years or only 3 months? All of these things provide rich insight in themselves, but that's just the first step. Ultimately, you said we can then join that to many other data sources, so we can understand what customers are then doing in the IVR that ultimately leads to that call. So that allows us to think about how we optimize the IVR. So if we see a customer going down a particular route, selecting particular options in the IVR, but then having a conversation that doesn't necessarily relate to those options, and that's one level of insight. We can also understand if we're having online support conversations, which is a big part of our conversations at this point, because we have overwhelmingly the vast majority of our transactions are digitally self-serve. Our contact center, as much as we handle a substantial number of calls, is a tiny fraction of our customer interactions. So we can understand where customers do call us for online support, what they've been doing online. So we can look at our e-servicing events, whether they've logged in, whether they've blocked their account, locked their account, have they done it multiple times? And we can go beyond that almost to any data source. We can look at transactional data if necessary, what the customer's transactional behaviours are over time, and anything ultimately that's relevant to why they felt the need to call us. So in an ideal world, we want a customer not to have to need to call us, but if they do need to call us, we want to make that journey as smooth and as painless as possible. And like I said, speech analytics is the starting point in expanding that. But we also have text analytics because we have a digital messaging service, so we can look at our customers are channel switching. So we can look at if a customer's called us within a few hours of the chat or vice versa, and we can cross-reference and check those. It's the additional data sources that you pull in that gives it a lot of its richness, and it's depending on what you're hoping to achieve, but certainly the value gets more and more amplified the more data that you can link into it and enrich it further.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for that, Matt. I could carry on talking with you about speech analytics for the rest of the day, but I'm getting flashing lights from my Emily, who's moderating here. So I think Emily, sorry, are we opening the floor to any questions that have come in?
Yeah, so I think we've got time for one question before we wrap up today. So the question is, do you use any additional data to support and enhance the data set and analytics, or do you use that to push analytics data into any other systems within NewDay? So that's to you, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, we briefly kind of covered this, which is something about the metadata and how we link it. But I guess one of the ways that we do that is we ingest the speech data into our cloud platform, where we store many different types of data from around the company about the customers, and that allows us to kind of link that organically. And on the back of that, we can build kind of self-refreshing reports. On a day-by-day basis, we can look at how our speech analytics data aligns with our voice of the customer data, how it aligns with our e-servicing data, with our IVR data, with our transactional data. We can also cross-reference it with, for example, marketing data. Now, if we've sent out 1 million mailings to our customers, what has been the impact? Has that driven calls? Was it intended to drive calls? Was it not intended to drive calls? So there's a number of different ways that we can link in that data, but it certainly adds to the value.
Thanks so much. Well, thank you, Matt, and thank you, Don, for that. That was perfect. Thank you to everyone for joining our webinar today. We're going to be sending a follow-up email and a survey post this call, so please do reach out if you have any other further questions. Thanks both.
Thanks everyone. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye
Bye now.
Bye.